So now we can resume acting
But
natural
now-
and normal, like nothing's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So how'd the braiding clinic go?
Well, that was pretty good. We had we were going to limit it to 7 people, and one guy called the day before and said he had problems of some kind, couldn't make it, so we ended up with 6, and maybe that was a good thing because 6 seemed to be plenty. And we had a goal to send them home with a hackamore they made and a pair of reins and romal that they made. And we were a little concerned we weren't going to make our goals, but we did. And they got here at 8 in the morning. My wife fed them 3 meals a day, and sometimes they were here into the night, but they made it. The reins and romal, they got them braided up, and they got all the end buttons done, and some of them got their reins on that go on buttons on the side of a horse's neck. Got a pretty good start on that, and they knew enough that they could finish them at home. So, like any clinic, there'll be a range of talent people have, and a range of how hard they try. And so, but we got her done, and we had to babysit them. I don't know if how many. You could tell some of them couldn't wait to get home and get going on it, and I don't know if I have a videotape that I made, and some of them studied the videotape. Some of them took the videotape home with them, and I think they're going to make it. How many of them are going to go on with it? I don't know. Some of them surely were going to, but anyway, we were glad when it was over. We both had a pretty good nap in the middle of the day after, almost like a horse clinic.
So I've got a question there, Bryan. So I'm assuming you've obviously done a bit of braiding. Is this the first time you've done a braiding class, or have you been doing those for a while?
I spent quite a bit of time in Elko, so I was up there and knew a lot of people around Elko. So I think twice we had a braiding class. I can't remember if it lasted a couple days there in Elko too, during the Elko Poetry Gathering. So other than, I had one at a community college in Elko too, at night. And so I have, but not for a while, not for quite a while. And I had a friend from Tennessee, Jarrett Pistol, and he was big help. I'm glad he was there. I don't know if I'd want to take on 6 people by myself. So
I bet. Yeah. So I was going to ask you, from doing those classes, have you been able to determine what the best personalities are good at braiding? Because from some of the braiders I've been around a little bit, I still can't tell if it's like tenacity that gets people through it, or if it's being docile and easily, I don't know, like lulled into something that to me I would find a little bit boring, but they just trudge through and eventually finish off.
One woman was like an overachiever, and a little bit like you see in the horse clinics. And you wanted to tell her, slow down a little bit, everything's going to be okay. And then there was another fellow that never lost track of his coffee cup, and any time off he had, he'd go back to the coffee cup, and you wanted to tell him, come on, we only got 4 days. And anyway, I don't know what it takes, really. Some people are more natural than others. I just know that. And getting along with horses, about the same deal.
So
I don't think, I didn't know, I've been at this since high school, but I didn't know that I don't believe I'm a real natural, because it's either that or I'm a heck of a teacher, because everybody seems to get it quicker than I did. And I think I just had it in my mind, I'm going to do this. I don't care how hard it is or how much time it takes. I'm going to do it. But what they learned in 4 days was more like 40 years for me.
Hmm.
So I had people that.
So,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, so, but isn't that kind of the deal? Like, isn't that why you go to a clinic? Because I mean, you're the way I look at it is you're going somewhere to have someone help you save you a lot of time, right? So like
It's all.
that's the value. That's why you travel from Tennessee to go
Mhm.
braid with Bryan, right? Because he's got 40 years of experience and he can show you some roads, maybe what roads to go down, and more importantly, what roads not to go down.
Hopefully, and that's the
Yeah.
whole. That's the idea about the horse clinics is efficiency, and everybody would like to get maximum results with minimum effort. If they
Yeah.
come to a clinic, I hope they're thinking uh, it'll save me a bunch of time and a bunch of work. If you have some, life's too short for trial and error. I mean, not that you couldn't, but makes it much more difficult. So that's the whole idea of a clinic is getting more done with your time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish I had a
So
clinic,
before
and
we,
I did. I had a. Go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say because this is all great stuff. Before we get too far down the rabbit hole, I did want to just let everybody listening know that if you can't tell by now, our guest today is Bryan Neubert, and this is episode 42 of the podcast. Ben, yeah. So this is episode
Yep.
42 of On the Move, and we're with Bryan Neubert, and obviously Bryan is a very experienced braider. 40 years. That's quite a long time to be working with rawhide. That's very impressive. And horsemanship clinician. I think you've mentioned that you work with dogs as well, and um, we don't try to list off everyone's accolades, and I'm sure we'll get to it. But that's who we're talking to today. And but the latest thing you've been doing is teaching people how to braid, and that's pretty awesome because it sounds like if that's what you really wanted to do, to go sit with someone who's done it for 40 years and try to make something like the whole time. I feel like that's probably really important as opposed to maybe you sitting there and showing them like a couple different patterns, but they're never really finishing everything in 4 days. Like you kind of dove deep on one thing as
Yeah,
opposed to
well,
doing a lot of
not to
different
get
stuff.
them.
I'm no
It,
braiding expert, but
it was a beginner class, so
okay.
most people had never done anything. So I had to keep it pretty simple. And there
Mm-hmm.
was one lady that had, like, I sat everybody down right off the bat and asked them, "So do you have any experience, and what is it?" And there was a lady there that had made hackamores and reins, and I thought, "Oh boy, what am I going to do with her?" Because I said, "Well, you might help us teach this thing," but I said, "I'm going to take you off to the side, get these people busy working on something, find out what you don't know, and see if I can help you on it." And she was a pretty good student. It was fun to have her around. Yeah.
Awesome.
I guess in some regards, that probably wasn't much different than some of your horse clinics where you're doing a more
It's a
foundational
wide
class and you
range.
have someone show up in a bridle and you have to help them from where they're at along with the rest of the class.
It's a wide range, and they're so different, and it can be it can be difficult. I'll just tell you that. But you got let's say you got 8 or 10 colts to start. Every horse there is different, and every person is different. You got, at least what I do is try to evaluate everything I can and see if I can get them going without getting anybody hurt. And sometimes that takes asking the people if they wouldn't mind if somebody else got the first few rides on their horse. If there's somebody there that I know, and usually it doesn't offend them. But that's big time. And then, boy, horsemanship can really be difficult because a big range of experience that the horses come with and the people come with. So all you can do is just do my best and see what happens. But it's not always an easy job. I tell my wife it would be interesting to see if I quit the clinics, if my hair would come back in brown again.
Oh, that you might have something there.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Sell that if you could package it. A lot of men out there want that.
I know a lot of people that do clinics, and they all got the same story. I mean, the day after the clinic, if there's any chance, I could sleep for 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the day, which I never do. And I thought something was wrong with me, but everybody I talked to's got the same deal. It's a stress.
Yeah,
I mean, you have,
bet.
in the colt starting, you have people who are trusting you with their safety. And a lot of them have no idea what they're getting into. And it's a stress. I take it kind of personal if there's a buck off or an injury. You know.
Yeah. So
Just talked to Joe
you mentioned
Walter this morning about that.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, he was
You
telling me about a
mentioned
Mustang.
that you were go ahead, Brian. I want to hear this.
I was going to say, he was telling me about a difficult horse he had at a clinic here lately, asking me my opinion on it. And he said, I didn't want this guy getting on this horse. And I said, I'd much rather have somebody down on me for not advancing to them riding one than trying to figure out if we can get a helicopter to land in the yard. And he agreed with me.
Yeah. So I remember when we talked earlier trying to set this deal up, you mentioned to me that you did, I guess at least one or two, I don't know how many, but you did some clinics with Tom Dorrance. And I guess a question I have for you would be, can you remember when doing a colt starting clinic became a thing? Like when that whole deal started happening, like were you doing it then? Did you get into it later? Like how did it start? Where, like for example, I know there's like stories, like we've had Buster McCleary on here, and he's talked about how Ray Hunt came and did a colt starting like at the ranch there, but that was like with like their ranch cowboys and stuff. When did it become a thing to like have the public bring their colts for a weekend and then we were all going to start our colts together?
I had actually I was working on a ranch, and one guy that I worked with said, if I could get a group of my family together, would you help us? And that was during my vacation on that time on that ranch. But I kind of got starting horses. I think I was 11 and by myself to start with. And looking back on it, I had a few total babysitters. I mean, like the kind that anybody could start. And then when I was 14, the winter I turned 15, I met a neighbor named Bill Dorrance, and he'd been my neighbor just over the fence for all my life, but I never met him until I met his boys in high school. And the reason that I never knew him was because our homes were not near the border. And once I met up with him, he began to helped me with everything, with the braiding and the roping and starting colts and everything. He was the best at everything that I wanted to learn. And I could ride to his house in 1 hour and 45 minutes, mostly uphill, and I could get home in about 45 minutes because it was straight down. And that was in the San Lucia Mountains there out of Salinas, California. So when did I? So I started taking on horses for the neighbors, and he would help me. And then went off to college, and I was determined not to let college interfere with my education. So I wasn't a real good student at the college, but I got a lot of horses started there. One fellow that had...
What were you studying in college, Bryan?
Oh, animal science. But I was learning more.
That's not too far off from working with horses.
I was brainwashed from birth that I was going to college. And so it wasn't easy to get, I couldn't get out of that hardly. But what I wanted to do was learn more about the horses. And I was spending more time with the horses during college than I was with the books. I wasn't a very good student. I stuck it out for a couple of years. And, I had quite a few little things going on there at school. I mean, one fellow that owned the bucking horses, his family had a whole string of horses, dude horses. They had like a guest ranch or something, hunting camp or something like that. And he brought a bunch for me to start. And, I would help people when I was going to school. Or, I'm not really proud of it, but I sometimes would see something with other kids and it wasn't going so good, like having trouble catching or loading their horse. And I might slip down there after dark and see if I could spend some time with their horse. And I know it wasn't the right thing to do. If I'd have asked them, they probably would have said have at it, but I couldn't afford to take the chance. So I did some on the sneak. And then when I got out of college, then Bill Dorrance was kind of my agent, and he had 4 or 5 different directions that I could go, and told me what the deal was and what it paid and what was expected of me. But he said, there's one deal I have for you that I want to lay on you, and it pays nothing. And I said, so what's that? And he said, if I buy, I think he bought 7 colts, and I will trade my time on you for your time on my horses. And I jumped at that. You bet. They never paid me to go to college. So to be around him, I was getting plenty of pay just with my education. And that was pretty fun. And then he had a friend that he introduced me to named Ray Hunt. He's the guy that went on to do clinics, but not at that time. He was just starting colts. So he asked Bill if he could borrow me. He had quite a bunch of them to get going. And I ended up going back there with him 4 times, 3 more times after that one time. And so that was pretty good experience. So then he got me a job in Nevada, and maybe that was on a big ranch, maybe one of the bigger ones in the state. And that was probably the first time that I was kind of on my own with pretty good bunches, and they were older horses. They were some 9-year-olds and a whole crop of 8-year-olds and wild, like way wilder than these Mustangs. I mean, they never been handled. They get them in to castrate them and brand them, and that's about it. So that was really good experience. So I stayed with them for off and on. My family has a ranch in Salinas, and that'd give me a chance to get back with Bill and I could ride up to his house, like I said. So I would start colts there in the wintertime, and when they started calving and Brandon, and then I got back to Nevada and started horses for them. Did that for 5 years, and back and forth.
Hey, Bryan.
Yeah.
Can I hold you up for just a minute, because we're covering a lot of territory? But I wanted to ask you a question. Well, you said, so Bill Dorrance traded you some time, his time, for your time helping him on his horses.
Yeah.
That's sort of like a working student sort of deal. What did that look like, his time working with you? Did he like take off an afternoon and just sort of ride with you, or do you recall how things went when you were sort of like his working student?
There was a neighbor that had a cow camp down the country, and I had a few horses for other people. So I could ride up to his house. I don't know, it seemed like an hour and a half or something. And we might have worked. Yeah, he just shut everything down and worked with me. And when I was done, I had to go back to that cow camp and be there the next morning. And it was a good time. Helped me with the roping.
Wow.
You can't believe. I wanted to rope. I wanted to be a cowboy. Actually, if I could back up a little bit more, my family had a ranch down Indian from Bill. And about 80% there was 5 of us boys with my 3 cousins and brother. And we had to do general ranch work, but probably 80% of our time was moving handline sprinkler pipes. And when I was about 12, this is way before I met Bill, I read an article in Western Horseman about a crew of cowboys that's all they did was handle cattle. And, we did general ranch work besides the sprinkler pipe, but I'm going to say maybe 2% of handling cattle with a horse. And these guys on this crew in the article, that's all they did, like no sprinkler pipe. And I just told myself at about 12, someday I'm going to be part of one of them crews. If there's anything I can do about it, I'm going to be part of one of those crews. And that was a big part of my life. So you asked me about clinics. I was part of those crews. In fact, I was the leader of those crews, cow boss on some big ranches. So it wasn't till after I was married and had 3 kids going that I started in on the clinics. So I never thought I would do that, but I was having too much fun in the cowboy life, and I got on some big ranches and just fun. Just the 2%.
That's pretty funny how you had that.
Teenage.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that realization about the difference between a cowboy that actually gets to just ride herd on cattle and then the ones that fix a lot of fence. Bryan, I'm 26, so I haven't been doing anything that long. But in 2015, when I was 18, I grew up, my family, my dad's a contractor, and, we didn't have a ranch. We had some animals. So I got a job in Montana, and I just got a ranch hand job. I thought that was a cowboy job. And so I went to this ranch, and it was great. It was a great place to start, but we did a lot of haying. We did a lot of irrigating. And I remember about 6 months into that, I started to realize that there were guys that got to ride horses all the time.
Yeah.
And then I had a job where you rode a horse about once a week. And one of the older guys there said, "Yeah, son, next time you're looking for a cowboy job on your next one, when you do your interview, ask them if they own a tractor. And if they say yes, pass them up, go somewhere else."
Well, I tried to focus on bigger ranches that had crews for doing all the other stuff and crews for staying on horseback and starting horses. And actually, Ray Hunt had worked all over Elko County or a few places, And Bill Dorrance had gone up and helped his brothers. Tom Dorrance was there in Battle Mountain, and his brother Jim Dorrance worked in Nevada, cow boss. So that's why I would hear their stories, and I would I gotta. I remember Ray Hunt asking me, I said, you think there's any way I could get a job on one of those big outfits? And he said, well, what do you want? Education or adventure? And I said, well, kind of both, but I want to go somewhere where you just stay a horseback all the time. And so he made a call, and next morning he said, I got you a job. And it was on the biggest one. And the horses were like the worst reputation in Nevada, but I wanted to learn. Sometimes you have to take yourself out of the comfort zone for your education purposes, you know. And I stayed with them for 5 years, like I said. And in the spring and summer and fall, I'd stay there and then go back to California and start horses, and I could be around Bill some more. And barely knew his brother Tom, just kind of met him. My brother and I bought some horses that he had for sale, and that's about it. And then it was a few years later that he called and wanted to know if I would take a job starting a bunch of horses with him. And I had just committed to start a bunch of horses for another neighbor there in Elko. I told him I just can't come. I'm just getting ready to start in on another guy. And he said, that's okay. Well, the guy they did hire, he didn't last too long. He lasted till I fulfilled my commitment with the neighbor. And then I beat it down there and got to work with Tom. And that was another deal that they bought 19 horses from a big ranch in Battle Mountain, and they wanted somebody to help get them going. So he was telling me, he came up to the fair in Elko, and he was telling me that they looked like after that guy quit that it sort of let the wind out of their sails and they might abort the whole project. And I said, ask them if they would hire me for no pay, just to be with you. And he called right back and he said, like, how soon can you come? Because that'll suit him. But then when I got there, they wanted to pay me. And I said, no. The deal was that I'm here to work with Tom. And the owner of the ranch said, you're going to do it my way. I am going to pay you or you're out of here. So I said, here's my Social Security number. Let's get this going. So that was just great. That was really, that was, I think Tom Dorrance, Bill Dorrance was so good. I mean, really a good cowboy, really a good roper, and just a good horseman, but more on the advanced, like he would keep one around its whole life. And Tom, he'd spent his life starting horses and working with problem horses of all kinds and helping on the ranches with those horses that had troubles. And so that was really good experience. And I mean,
what would a day in the life look like with like when you were, either Bill or Tom? I'm sure it was different, but like when you were down there starting colts with Tom, what would a day in the life look like? Like what would he have you be doing, and what would he be doing? And was he working on trying to educate you, or was he just worried about the horses and you were kind of a byproduct? Or
no, he was all three of those guys that I mentioned, Ray and Bill and Tom, seemed to have a passion for my progress. Why, I don't know, but I was blessed big time. And I mean, I think about this once in a while, how if I could change my life so I could be with anybody that I know of in the world, that part of it I wouldn't change at all. It just could not have been better. So a day in the life. Again, I was in a cow camp down off the mountain from Tom. Tried to be at his place. I rode back and forth the colts that we started, and tried to be up there at 7. And this is kind of strange, but you got me thinking since you asked. We would just take off out in the hills, and we had 19 head of colts, so he would keep one in overnight, and I had the one that I rode home on the night before, and now we might have used the corrals a little bit for a week or so before this happened, but we just take off and had a pretty good pasture in the mountains and find those horses. We had 19 of them. Well, we had 17 because we're riding 2 of them. And when we'd find them, Tom had worked with them, mostly 2-year-olds, and he'd just bunch them up and cut one out for me. And he had them where he could catch them out in the hills. And some of them weren't very gentle, and they were not really safe for me to get on. He'd just catch them by a hind foot because they might try to kick me, saddling them. They were pretty green. And he'd catch them by a hind foot, and I'd kind of sack them out with my blanket a little bit and put my saddle on there. Well, some of them, they would buck with the saddle pretty good. And so when I was done saddling, there was a period of time of this. I don't say this was the whole time I was there, but when it was necessary, then I would just take my snaffle bit off, the green one, and take the hind foot rope off, and let them rip. And some of them would buck around there pretty good and join those other horses, but he had them where he could bunch them up, and he'd kind of rip them around there and air them out and get them ready for me, and then catch them. He could just got so he could set them up to be caught, and he had a little snippet of grain in his pocket, and he'd been working on that previously, and put his lead rope around their neck, bring them to me, catch them by hind foot again, and I might get on and off of them, kind of half sloppy, until they look pretty good, and then step off, take his rope off, and away we'd go. And we might come back and find them again in an hour or so, and he'd do the same. We did that all day long. And most days, well, we'd come home for lunch, and then, but most days, at the end of the day, we never fed a flake of hay, because the horses we were riding had a full belly of grass. They didn't need feeding, and we never fed. Maybe on a Sunday, we took Sundays off, so on a Sunday morning, he'd probably throw them a little hay. I wouldn't. I lived off the mountain and would take the day off on Sundays, but we never even hardly used the corrals. And I'd never seen that done before, but pretty fun, really.
Yeah, I'd like to have seen a movie of that.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
That's like a scene from Star Wars or something, man. Like going off with Tom Dorrance into the mountains.
I felt pretty safe. When he was the youngest of 8 children, and everybody took off, and he was there by himself. And he said, I just kept horses scattered out all over with different bunches of cattle. And I'd keep a couple of horses with each bunch of cattle. And I got them where if what I was riding was getting tired, there was no trucks and trailers in those days. And he said I would just sort one of them off, and whichever one I wanted to ride, I would go on until they got a little tired. And every bunch of cattle he had a few horses, and he never kept anything, never fed any hay, never kept anything at home. So I never heard.
That's crazy.
We did so many things like that. I mean, that I'd never heard of before. And I can tell you this, nothing Tom did was because everybody else did it that way. Everything was different. I just mentioned catching a horse by the hind foot. I mean, 2 guys can get through a bunch of horses, wild horses, in a short period of time if they know how to operate that. I want to be careful what I say. Somebody might hear this and say, well, I can surely I can catch a horse by the hind foot, but how you do it means way more than what you do. And so the last time that I was around him, I knew it was going to be. He was kind of fixing to wind it up. And I was thinking ahead of time, what would be some good questions to ask him on our last visit? Probably going to be our last visit, in person anyway. And so I said, this catching a horse by the hind foot, it's such a cool deal. I'd never heard anybody doing it whose roots didn't go back to you. How would you ever get the idea to think that up? And he said, well, I remember right where it was. I had a wild mare in the lot at home, and I wanted to catch her around the neck. And I took a shot at her when she's coming out of the corner, and I missed her, and she stuck her foot in my rope. So I had her by the hind foot. And that's how it got started. And it worked out so good. He said, I'm gonna do this to everything, make a standard practice out of it. So that's what I would do. I got 3 children, and they pretty much make their living starting horses. And one of them runs a ranch with that, but they all catch them by the hind foot. Even those, I got one son in Texas, and these are some of the best horses that money can buy. He catches them all by the hind foot. So it's really a good lick. The other question I asked.
All these stories you're telling. Oh, who said that? We got a little delay. Well, I was going to say all those stories. It reminds me of one that I've heard about Tom Dorrance circulating, and something like he went off to travel around a little bit, and he came upon some guys branding. And so he stopped to watch them and saw a little corral with some young horses off in the distance. And he asked if he could borrow one of them. And all the guys looked up at him like he was crazy. They said, no, those horses haven't been ridden yet. We haven't even worked with them. He said, yeah, well, can I use one? And they're like, yeah, I guess so. And then he went on down over the hill and spent a little time and then came back riding one of those horses and branded all afternoon. Is that sort of accurate?
That was at the Flying D right there at Gallatin Gateway, and he had handled those colts as yearlings the year before, so he kind of knew what was there. And
okay,
but that wouldn't be for him. That wouldn't be big a feat.
He must have caught that horse by the hind foot.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he might have as a yearling. And I mean, I've done it with suckers before, and not even with a rope. I mean, just follow a mare and a couple day old colt, and just follow behind them and catch them with my hand by the hind foot, just like a sheep, and just let them kick around there till they slow down, then get the other foot, let them halfway follow their mother, and that sets them up for, well, they're learning how to yield, which is an unnatural thing for a horse, and it's going to help when you trim their feet and put shoes on, and more than that, just a basic getting in a yielding frame of mind instead of a resisting frame of mind. And it's been a big help. I don't know how I got on that, but I asked him another question.
Yeah, we've been going around.
Yeah, I asked him another question over the dinner table. I knew he was going to invite me to supper that night, so I'd been really thinking. So I said, he was darn near blind, and he was ready to call it. And he did not long after that. But I said, well, how old were you when you started your first big bunch of horses? And he said, big bunch of horses would have been the spring that I turned 14. My brother Jim, older than I, had a contract to start a bunch of horses. And he said, it was just getting to be almost haying time. And he said, my dad really could have used us for haying. And he had a whole crew hired, but he could have used me and Jim for that project. But he said we were doing chores one day, but he never complained about it. His dad never would say, we're almost getting ready to start haying and you guys are taking on a project. Anyway, they were doing chores around there, and Jim hollers to Tom, hey, I look at the horses coming up the road. They didn't have trailers and trucks in those days. But he said, this is our horses, I'm pretty sure, Tom. And so Jim went over to, trotted up to open the gate to let him in the big lot. And Tom and his dad sort of separated there to turn them that direction. And the fellow that owned them, he hollered to Jim, but also loud enough to so that Tom and Jim both could hear him. He said, I want to apologize to you boys. I told you we had 61 or something like that, and I lost some in the timber, and I'm thinking we only got 53 or whatever. And Tom said, I could hear my dad under his breath say, too bad you didn't lose the whole works. Anyway, so that's when he got started. He said they'd only keep him a week. He was telling me about starting draft horses. I don't know if it was the same with saddle horses, but he said I'd get on them in the corral for the first time. And I had a sack of hay tied on the end of a rope right on my fork. And it was buckled in there with a hame strap. And he said I'd open the gate and it might do a little zigzagging to cross the bridge in the yard. There's a creek right there. And he said once I got out in the open country, I'd let them rip. And if I could feel them slowing down, I just unbuckled that hame strap and let the sack drag behind them. And they'd kick it into a higher gear for a quarter mile and start slowing down. And he said, he told me that, he said, you know, I don't share that with most people. And I said, how come? Because I know when I'm telling it, they're thinking, I wonder what else he's been lying to us about. But that would be no feat for him.
That's crazy, man.
Well, and then John Marvel was... him and his brother Tom Marvel owned his family owned the 25 ranch there at Battle Mountain. And John told me that Tom just getting on a horse for the first time in the round corral. And he said, you know, Tom, when you have time, could you run out and gather this one pasture of horses? And he said, well, I could do that right now. And he said, well, go ahead and ride your colt. It's not that serious. And he said, probably it'll be okay. And it took him a while to wiggle around there and get the gate open. But off he went and came back with the bunch of horses. Now, when you think about that, well, he's had me wrangle on horses on the first ride. But when you think about it, these horses are probably wrangled every day. The cavvy. That's what they call the bunch of horses, a cavvy. So when they see somebody coming on horseback, they bunch up and start heading for home. As far as the one you're riding, he sees a bunch of horses out there. He's going to run to them. And so it wouldn't be a whole lot of guiding and directing. You just sort of fall in with them and do like you do with any horse you're wrangling horses on.
Yeah, let it happen.
Yeah. But that's still a testament to Tom, and because a lot of folks have a real hard time letting stuff happen, you know, even if it was going to happen sort of naturally, like you just said, a lot of people have the tendency to really get in the way. So even if that would have happened, if you turned the horse loose, it might not have happened if they rode out there. They might have been trying to control it or be afraid or all kind of stuff. And it might have ended a lot differently than like Tom did.
Well, him and I went to Idaho one time, and we started 7 head of horses, and the people that were there that owned the horses had 6 people, and that left 1 for me. And so we turned them out in this lot, and he wanted to run them around there and reduce the risk of them bucking with the saddle and the rider. And he got me mounted up and gave me took his coat off and gave me 1 sleeve and and he kept one sleeve, and we kind of round and around, and had to drop it once in a while, but pretty soon had it where I could lap him on either side, swinging that coat back and forth, both of us swinging it, and pretty soon getting a loop going, like a full circle. And he said, okay, I'm going to give you the flag, and I want you to go out and warm those horses up. And I thought, okay, I had never done that before. And it was it was a little scary because I had never done it before, but I'd ridden horses that ran before. And well, he's just wanting to catch those other horses. Main reason for the flag was to keep something from slowing up and getting me a horse track on my shin. But it worked out it worked fine. But anyway, that's Tom. It's always
so
like
let me ask you this, Bryan.
Go ahead.
So, you're growing up and you're dealing with Bill, and you're going Tom, and doing these things that are like, in a way, they almost seem like supernatural with a horse, right? And you've talked about how you were motivated and you were interested in this stuff. Was there ever part of you that, being around someone like that, I mean, by a lot of accounts, people say, one of the most gifted horsemen of the last 500 years, like, was there ever part of you that kind of got down on yourself because you'd watch Tom do stuff and you're like, man, that's just effortless, and I can't even imagine how to get
Yes.
from where I'm at to halfway to where he is?
Well, a lot of times he would share something with me and I'm a student of horsemanship. I want to learn something about this before I decide I can't ride anymore. And he's all the time coming up with something. I mean, I go to clinics, I read books, I get videos, whatever it takes to learn. And he come up with more things that I've never even heard mentioned anywhere else. And like sometimes even when he's holding my hand, it's a struggle. And, I'm thinking, do I have a learning disability or what's wrong with me? And he, for a lot of that, he come up with it on his own head. He had a neighbor, Clifford Wade, who they named the Wade Tree Saddle after, and who was 20 years older than him. He helped him a lot. He had a brother, Fred, that died before I was born. He was the youngest of 4 boys, so he saw what worked and didn't work so great for them when they were starting bunches of horses. But a lot of it he dreamed up on his own. And I thought, how can you dream this stuff up and get it going when you're doing all you can to help me and I can't get it, or at least for a while? And it's a struggle. But he is just an amazing person. And I remember Ray Hunt, Tom Dorrance lived not too far from me. And I could be at his house probably. I'd drive over there in a half hour. But when I had been with Ray Hunt, that's all he would talk about is how much Tom helped him. If Ray and I ever took a road trip, it would be about 90% Tom Dorrance. And he kept telling me, don't you live right near him? And I said, I do. And you barely know him? And I said, yeah. And he said, you're going to go over there and you're going to work with him. And I was so shy. I thought, what if he turns me down? And I remember thinking, boy, this is just overwhelming for me. And I thought, I'll leave half an hour early in case I have a flat tire. And geez, what if I have a flat tire on the pickup and the trailer? So I better leave an hour early. And of course, I didn't have any flat tires, and I got there an hour early. But that was the first time. Then I had this job with him, and Ray kept telling me, "You're not going to believe this. This guy he is totally amazing." And after I got to know Tom, which he wasn't the easiest guy to get to know. In fact, kind of antisocial, in his words. And Ray told me you don't get to know him very easy. But after we got really acquainted, after I was there a month or so, I said, Ray Hunt bragged on your horsemanship every day I was with him. And I'll just tell you something. I watch you ride, and you don't look any different than anybody else. And he laughed, and he said, you know why that is? And I said, no, I thought I was going to see all this special stuff. But his horses were way different than I ever saw. I mean, way different. And he said, you know why that is? And I said, I sure don't. I've thought about it a lot. And he says, because it's the little things that make the big difference. You're not going to see the dirt flying when Tom's riding them. It's all so subtle. The average person, there's nothing to see unless he was explaining, and then you could see it. And on that note, when I worked for Ray, the last time I worked for Ray was on a ranch. And so it was all Joe Walter and my cousin, all a bunch of us, 19, 20, 21, right in those years. And so there was an older guy. And looking back on it, he was probably in his 40s. And he kind of kept to himself. And so I said, I thought he looked kind of lonely because all of us just a bunch of 19, 20 years old. So I struck up a conversation. And I said, so what are you done with your life? And he said, just cowboy. Oh, yeah. What states? Just Nevada. Oh, yeah. What ranches? Pretty much just the 25 there in Battle Mountain, Nevada. And I thought, oh, hey, no kidding. How long were you there? Well, it was a pretty good stretch, like 25 years or something. So I said, did you ever know a guy named Tom Dorrance? Oh, yeah. Heck, yeah. He was around there all the time. And he would show up every fall. And I said, what can you tell me about him? Not too much, except for he was the greatest horseman that any one of us ever even heard of. And you know what the strange part was? The guy never trained a horse. I says, what do you mean? Just what I said. He would stay home and ride when we all showed our best horses at the fair. And the worst horse in his string could have won any of those classes in Elko, stock horse classes. And he never, so it made me think back, what Ray was saying is it's so subtle you can't see it. But he bragged on him there quite a bit. But he said he never trained a horse. They just got good. I don't know how to explain it, but I knew what he was talking about. But he's a guy
go ahead,
that
Ben.
I thought if I was ever around a genius, like I have no way of measuring a person to whether they're a genius or not. But if I was ever around one that it was him, because he was like by far the smartest person that I was ever around. I mean, he could recall minute details from long ago or last week. I mean, first time I went over there on a weekend, the second time I went over on a weekend, I had a gray horse, and he said, well, I guess I haven't seen you and Gray now for, what's it been, 7 weeks? And I said, I don't think it's been that long. I mean, I didn't know how smart he was. But he said, well, let's just figure it out. Last Sunday we stayed home. Sunday before that we went to town. Sunday before that we stayed home. And he's counting. Sunday before that I went to see Bill, and it came right on 7. And he says, Sunday before that you were here. Yeah, 7 weeks. And I mean, that kind of stuff. We had 19 head of colts to ride, and he would say, we had a few buckskins, and he would say, boy, old Bucky's starting to come together today, isn't he? And I said, feels good. And see, we had 19, so we didn't ride them all every day. We were doing good to get about 3 rides a week on them. And he'd say, see, last time you rode Bucky, it was starting to come together. The time before that, when we moved those bulls, and to minute detail. And I think it was 3 days earlier you rode him, and it was this way. And I mean, just recalled every ride back to where I started working on what he was kind of coming together and finding, which was, I'm not used to that. I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, let alone all that stuff. I can recall one time I called him with a horse that I was having trouble with. And this is kind of like him. But he'd say, and I was on a big ranch in California. And he says, so I was trailing cattle with that horse. And he would say, what color is he, Bryan? What color? Well, he's brown. He's a brown thoroughbred. And so where did you take these cattle? And at the time, I'm thinking, what has that got to do with anything? So I said, well, we started at the Kinsavi Ranch and went over the mountains to the Cleveland Ranch. And it'd be like 2 years later, he'd say, yeah, this is kind of like that brown thoroughbred you rode when you were trailing cattle from the Kinsavi to the Cleveland. I'm thinking, I mean, I'd have 6 or 8 horses in my string, and I'm just fighting to think, what is he talking about? And he'd never seen the horse, and here I had it in my string for quite a while. But that was when I went to the Spanish Ranch. That's the big ranch in Nevada where I was. We talked a lot about different horses in the cavy, and some of them I didn't have, other people had. And he'd always say, what's his name? And I like, what's his name? After about the 3rd horse, I'd tell him the name, and I'd say, why do you want to know his name? Oh, you never know. I might end up there someday. And I could ask, do you guys have a horse named Rattler or Diaper or whatever it might be? And then they'd bring out those horses. I mean, I've never seen anybody with a brain like that. I mean, I went and picked him up in California and brought him up to where I was living on a ranch near here. And he would fall asleep at times. And he would say, he'd wake up and there would be a sign, how many miles to my town, and then just start going through. So let's see, we drove about an hour, wouldn't you say, on this highway, and then we cut off on this highway, and we went this way, and we cut off here. And I mean, he'd already committed himself never to drive again. And I said, why are you recalling these details like this? Oh, he said, somebody might ask me, how do you get to Bryan's house? And I can tell him. Anyway, that's the way his brain works. It's always
that's
way more. And he told me that a lot of your progress is going to be determined by your ability to observe and remember and compare. And he said, my brother Fred had a photographic memory. And I mean, he recalled everything in his life. And he said, I knew I wasn't born with what Fred had. So I went to work to develop the next best thing. And I said, what does that mean? Well, I learned poems and I learned cows and anything I could do to exercise the memory portion of my brain. So I'm thinking, who does that? But that's Tom.
Yeah. Boy, if he could see us now with smartphones and how lazy our brains can be allowed to act. Bryan, have you ever seen, there's a movie called Limitless with Bradley
Nope.
Cooper. And in that movie, he takes a pill, some drug dealer, something falls off a truck, or I forget how it happens, but he takes this pill. And basically the pill is a drug that allows him to access his full memory. And it's amazing. That's his key to success. He ends up going on to become a billionaire and a best-selling author. And, he beats up some guys in a back alley street fight and everything. But the key to the movie that unlocks, it's almost like a superhero movie, right? And the thing that unlocks his ability is memory and his ability to access all the memories, because he's seen it all. in his
Yeah.
life. He's like 40 years old. He's seen everything. He's encountered all the tools he would need, but he's a human. He can't access all that information. But that drug, and that's the whole point of the movie, that drug allows him to access it. And it's really quite a cool movie. And it makes me think of that every time I hear that about Tom Dorrance.
Oh, it's his brother Fred had those pills, I think, in his genetics. But I remember one time he said, I was cow boss on a big ranch in Nevada. And he called me up and he said him and his wife were traveling around. And they said, if it's okay, I want to come and see you. And on the ranch where I was cow boss in the 80s, his brother Jim was cow boss in the 40s. And so he said, can we go out to the barn and peek around a little bit? Because Tom was there. Actually, Jim broke his hip, I think. And Tom took the crew and went to the mountains and gathered yearlings. So he hadn't been there for 40 years, somewhere in there, 40 years. And it was kind of interesting. He said, so you had to lead your horse over a railroad tie to get in the barn. And he just stopped and he said, boy, there's been a lot of horses over this railroad tie in the last 40 years. It was square cornered and now it's round cornered. And he said, right over there was a round corral that my nephew, Jimmy Dorrance, made out of Quakey logs. And I said, that was there when I came. Joe Walter and I tore it down, made firewood out of it. It was about ready to fall down anyway. And the corral that's there, Joe Walter and I built. And so he started talking about in the mountains, when they gathered cattle, they took a drive. There was big holding fields 14 miles up the road. And they brought a pretty good bunch of yearlings down to the river. And as he was going, anytime we changed pastures, I would ask whoever was nearest me, what's the name of this pasture? And then he recalled the names, and he didn't get it just right. He had a few, he said, and I wasn't going to help him. I thought, I want to see what he does here. So he said, now the next one, when we come out of this Hanks Creek field, we go into Pole Canyon, right? And I was like, no. And it's Pole Creek. And it was Pole Creek Lane. He was close. I let him suffer for a while. And another one was Rock Creek. And he looked at me and he said, that's not right, is it? And I said, no. And on the ones that he missed, and he just kept going and he just couldn't quite get it. That was 40 years. He went through there one time and asked somebody the name of it. And the name of that field was Flat Rock. Oh yeah, Flat Rock. And then there was another one down there that was Bullfield. We put him in the Bullfield, but that's not right, is it? And I said, no. And I let him suffer for a while and ponder it. And I finally had to tell him it's the Bull Shed. And there was no shed in the pasture, but maybe at one time there was. But anyway, that was pretty amazing. And he was just chock full of those kind of things. Constantly
Wow.
trying to exercise his brain,
Yeah.
Did anyone ever
And that's
encourage Tom to go on Jeopardy?
I don't know if he didn't watch much television, but his wife said he has got the mind of an elephant, the memory of an elephant. And
He probably could have bought the West if he had gone on there a couple of times.
but money, that's another odd thing about him. Now, he was the last of 8 children on the ranch. He had no wife, had no children. And he said, why am I working my tail off for this? And he got a hold of all his siblings and said, I'm thinking about selling it. What do you think? And every one of them told him, have at it. But then he had no income that I know of but he didn't spend money. He was he rehealed his own boots. And I mean, I noticed one time when we were fixing some fence, which we hardly ever did, He's down on his knees, and I see tire tread on his heels. I said, did you recap your heels? Yeah. He said, it's not worth paying somebody to do. You could countersink those nail heads, put the rubber on the grinder. And I mean, it was a total pro job, except for it was actually tire tread. And, I mean, a bunch of things like that. So money, I mean, Ray Hunt made a household name out of Tom, but he could care less. He liked to work with horses, and he liked to help people, but he just took off. And I said, how far did you get in school? Well, flunked out. He did have a job for a little while. That's why I'm recalling that. But he says,
Yeah.
I didn't graduate 8th grade with some of the other kids. Flunked out. And he said, I failed 2 subjects and they wouldn't let me pass. Agriculture and mathematics. So I said, okay, when you did leave and you had a job for a while, what did you do? I worked for the bank appraising ranches. And he'd flunked math and agriculture. But then struck out on his own and just went where there was lots of horses to start. I mean, I happen to know he helped the Marvels there at the 25 for years start horses, and they have a crew of people. And he was sort of leading the crew, you might say. And he said, and Tom Marvel told me, that guy never would take any wages. And so I asked Tom Dorrance about that. Is that true? You never took any pay for all that time? I mean, they'd start 75 head of horses in a whack. And I said, why would you do that? Oh, I told him, if I'm on the payroll, you could fire me. And if you're not paying me, then you can't fire me. And which was crazy because, I mean, they thought he was the Messiah. I mean, they just couldn't believe what they were getting done with him. So one time I was at his house after Ray Hunt increased his popularity, and we were visiting in the living room, and the phone rang for the 3rd or 4th time in about a half an hour. And his wife, you could tell she was about shot too, and she hollered in, Tom, it's for you. And he kind of heaved a big sigh and rolled his eyes, and he said, my life was so much happier when nobody knew who Tom Dorrance was. And he shunned any kind of attention. He would shun it. I'll tell you, I mean, I've been with him a lot in different situations. And if it was at a branding, he would take his plate over by himself somewhere and wouldn't interact with the people. If you were at some kind of function, he would be like, I mean, somebody sweeping floors, he'd go visit him and talk to the janitor and about his life and what was going on. And you would never know. He could be with a pretty good group of people. If somebody didn't bring it up, you would have no idea that he ever rode a horse in his life. I mean, I never met anybody like that. He's my total hero.
How did Bill compare?
Well, Bill was more social. And Bill could. I was with Bill at the Salinas Valley Fair, and we were going to go over and watch the rodeo, and we were going across this big lawn, and there's somebody over there trying to load a horse in a trailer. And Bill says, what do you suppose they're doing over there, Bryan? And I said, looks to me like they're trying to load a horse in a trailer. And he said, that's what I was thinking. Let's just saunter over there and see what's going on. And so I thought, now what are you going to do? How are you going to get involved in this? And he says, how are you people today? And just kind of visiting there a little. And he said, you're having a little trouble loading a horse, it looks like. Yeah, we've been here for an hour and we can't. And I thought, okay, now how are you going to get involved in this? I knew he was itching to, but he says, a fella showed me something one time that really, really helped on a deal like this. And they're after a little bit, they're like, well, what was it? And he said, can I borrow him for a little bit? And he walked with a cane, and he kind of used that cane, and he explained how that, building a foundation, and pretty soon he's loading and unloading and all that. Now, to give you the same example, you asked me, how do they compare? Tom and I were riding colts on this ranch where we had the job together, and he couldn't hear very well. But, of course, I could hear pretty good at that time. And I could hear a diesel pickup coming. We had to wind around this road in the mountains, and these neighbors had to drive through this ranch to get to town. And so if he would have heard that pickup, we would have ducked off in the trees till they went by. And so he was stuck. Wherever we were on the road, they shut the motor off, and they like, Tom, how you doing, and all this. And he said, "This fine. How are you people?" And I mean, this was the entire conversation. He said, well, this last little shower sure helped the country, didn't it? And they're claiming we might get another one on Friday. Anyway, it's sure good to see you people, and you have a good day. And he was friendly, but he cut it off. As soon as their pickup was gone, I said, can I tell you something? I mean, I got to know him pretty good. And he said, sure. When somebody shuts the motor off, they're wanting to visit. And he said, I know that, but I'm antisocial. And I said, how do you know you're antisocial? And he said, well, my sister used to tell me I'm antisocial. My wife tells me I'm antisocial. So I'm pretty sure I'm antisocial. So that was the difference between those two guys. Didn't take much for Bill to get a conversation going. But that all changed with Tom. I was in Nevada for quite a few years and raised 3 kids with my wife, and came back to California, and I could see he was quite a bit different. And so I called him on it. I said, you're different than you were when I was with you before. And he said, it could be. I said, no, could be. I mean, I can see it. And he said, and he didn't deny it, but he said, I'll just tell you, for the first part of my life, I looked for the good in animals. And recently, I've been trying to find the good in people. That's all I can tell you. And he would do a clinic. And he did clinics with Ray Hunt, and only one with me. You talked about that earlier. Only one with me. And I'd done a bunch of clinics myself prior to that. But somebody asked us if we'd do it together, and we did, but only one. But I remember I was at his house, and I was looking at his calendar, and spring was coming, and I kind of went through his calendar, and I said, you got 11 clinics coming up. Yeah, he says, when you're in your early 80s, you can put it on the calendar, but that doesn't mean you're going to be there. And anyway, when we started that, I'll never forget this. I don't know if anybody cares, but it was the very first time that I went to work with him to work on horses. I was scared. And he said, he'd heard about me from his brother and things. So he said, and I brought 2 horses, and he said, you need to realize that I can't teach you anything. And I heard that he was very, very perceptive, but all I did was get out of the pickup and walk toward him to shake hands with him. I thought, he can tell, what my caliber by just doing that. But then he went on to say, I can't teach you anything, but I'm going to do everything I can to help you learn. Well, that seemed like a contradiction to me. And years later at that clinic, we started the clinic, and he tells the people, is the sound okay? And it's sure a pretty day, and thank you for coming, all this. And he said, now, before we get started, I want to mention that anybody here that's come thinking they're going to learn something, before we get started, it might be a good time for you to load your horse up and go home. And you could have heard a pin drop. Even I was like, did I just hear this? And he said, because if any learning takes place, it's not going to be here in the next 4 days. It'll be at home when you begin to practice what you've been exposed to here. And I thought, that is so true. So true. And you wonder how many people come to a clinic thinking, oh, my clinic or anybody else's, oh, he does clinics. He's going to show me all kinds of things. And like a bunch of trainer tips or something like that. You know what it is? I'm trying to help people learn ways they can work on themselves, not their horse. Because the horse can get a lot of things pretty easy if it's exposed to them in a way that they can understand.
Yeah. So, Bryan, I've got this question for you then, because it's just interesting to hear your perspective with Tom and Bill and Ray, because it sounds like you got to spend a lot of time around these guys and kind of know them. You know, they were mentors, but they were also kind of, they were friends, And so now today, like from the perspective Ben and I have as people who are getting into horsemanship and working with horses and trying to get things done a lot later along in the timeline, right? You go back to people like Tom and Ray, and there can almost be, and it, especially with guys our age, there can almost be like those guys are like deified in a way, because now I'm not saying that's, I don't think anyone should be deified, but like for me personally, I've watched all of Ray's tapes, read Ray's books, same with Tom. Like I have the utmost respect. But I imagine it's probably weird for you as someone who like knew them from you being a young man to then kind of see them become these big household names and see people kind of deify them, and probably in a much different way than what you viewed them.
Yes.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I can think of Ray Hunt had that Tom Dorrance benefit when Tom was going through bad health, and Tom told me, I'm coming to that deal in Fort Worth. And then later he called and he said, I just don't think it's too smart that I go. And somebody was telling me, they said, boy, that's disappointing. I just thought if I could shake the man's hand. And I said, well, let me tell you my situation. After I had a wife and 3 kids, every time I would see him, starting with my kids and wife, he'd give us all a hug. I'm not a real big hugger, but I don't know. He probably hugged me 20 times over the period. And I said, it never helped my horsemanship one speck. I just talked to Joe Walter about this very thing here just about noon today. And we were talking about that. Actually, Tom Dorrance gave my 2 boys his saddle, a saddle that he recovered himself, the first wade tree saddle ever was. And he said something about, they still got that saddle? And I said, they do, but it's only because they haven't found anybody to sell it to yet. And I know a lot of people would just gasp saying, you mean tell me they would sell Tom Dorrance's saddle, the first weight tree saddle ever was? And I said, they're quite a bit like me. They're not nostalgic. There's no spirit in that saddle. And Joe Walter said, I can remember when I got my first Dale Harwood saddle. Dale Harwood's a guy that covered a bunch of trees that he made, wade trees. And he said, boy, I thought my horses they're really going to come on now. I got a wade tree saddle. And he said, it never made one speck of difference. So
Yeah.
it's a hero worship kind of thing. And but Tom would not be for that. If Tom knew that my boys were thinking about selling the saddle he gave them, he'd probably say, good for them. You know, they don't ride it. They rode it for a while, and they got so many saddles now they don't need Tom's saddle. I think they put a new rigging in it or something, and that's about it. I mean, no spiritual stuff involved. And so I never did feel that way. I don't just friends. You know, I just was blessed.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I mean, all I can do is thank the Lord for it, because here I grew up. Starting at 12, I wanted to be on a cowboy crew. I never even knew a Dorrance. Well, I heard that our neighbors were named Dorrance, but I didn't know they knew anything. And super humble people. And Bill, like, I thought someday I wouldn't mind showing a stock horse. And I'm in Bill's tack room, and here's the champion bridle horse for Salinas Rodeo. And right down the way, champion hackamore horse for Salinas Rodeo. And I said, you've shown some? Oh, a little. I just went to town is all. Which town was like one of the biggest stock horse shows on the West Coast. And here you are, a rancher, and you clean the clocks on some of the best showmen in the West, trainers. And I mean, as soon as he got that out, he wants to change the subject. I had a couple of good horses, and anyway, let's do something else. He just wanted to get off the subject. So I mean, they're very, very different people.
Yeah, that seems like a real grounding way to think about it, and along the lines of what Joe was saying. Like, I was glad you clarified that story a bit earlier about how Tom Dorrance had stopped by that branding and used that colt, because
he knew him.
I never realized that, that he had ridden that horse a little while before, and it kind of brings that story back to earth.
No, he just worked with them. So he
worked with it, right?
He knew the different horses. Yeah.
But he knew the horses. And like the story I had heard was like as if he was sojourning in a foreign country and stopped by and borrowed some horse out in the pasture. And a story like that can grow and grow and grow. And then pretty soon you hear it and you think, yeah, that's a great story, but you don't believe it as much.
Well, there's
hearing those little details. It doesn't take anything away from Tom Dorrance.
No.
But it makes it a little more realistic, and you can go, wow, that's impressive. But it's not like Joe was talking about, things can become deified, and then it becomes unattainable for the rest of us mortals. Right. And Bryan, that sort of leads into a question I wanted to ask you while we're talking about this, and it has to do with the difference between people being born with feel for horses or being able to learn it and pick it up. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that over the years you've spent working with people and your own journey.
Well, see, Tom had probably he was a lot younger than 12 when his brothers were taking on horses for the neighbors, and their family raised horses. And, I always thought if their father had been an aviator, these guys might have been on the Nassau team or something. I mean, that's the life that he led. And so he got involved with it, and he loved to challenge himself. And, I don't know if it would be, I'm just having a recall, but I was talking about his evolution. And he said that his brother Fred was not only had a photographic memory, but athletic, super athlete besides. And he could do everything. He was a super good rawhider and rode bucking horses in the rodeos and invented a lot of good roping shots. And here's what they said about Fred. And I heard this separately from all three brothers over the years. If Fred was around anybody that could do anything better than him, it would be not long before he was doing it as well, and not much longer before he was doing it better. Not that Fred was competitive at all, but he was into personal progress. And they all seemed to be. And their sisters and their mother was a teacher. And maybe the teaching gene was in them, those guys. But they, they would do nothing that might elevate them above other people. It was not show off kind of stuff. It was just personal progress. Anyway, he was telling me about his evolution, and he said Fred would come home every winter for Christmas, and he said I had all kinds of problems with saddle horses and draft horses, but I thought, well, Fred's going to be here. I'll just hang on till Fred gets here. And Fred could clean up anything I had, just like quick. And so he said, I'll tell you, I think the time that I progressed the most was getting the news of Fred's death. And he said, I thought, golly, if I'm going to get this, it's got to come from inside here. There's no more Fred holding my hand. And I was around these guys in California, all three of them, and then took off for Nevada. I mean, I got myself, I'm starting a whole crop of 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds that are just wild as could be. And there's nobody to call. I mean, we didn't even have a phone. I mean, and then so I kind of knew the places that I needed focus on. So when I'd get back to California every winter, I would inquire about these things and ask questions and try to remember everything that I learned. And so I'll just tell you, I mean, I got a whole lot out of working with them, but I think maybe I learned more because when I was by myself, because it forced me to do a lot more thinking and pondering for the answers. And I mean, I knew these guys were going to die. And now, Joe Walter is a good friend of mine, and we've learned, he's worked with the same people, and we're all the time sharing ideas. Randy Riemann is another guy, and Jerry Pardue is New Mexico, a good hand, and so my 3 kids have been a big help to me. They have, I mean, all 3 kids that I have, they had ponies and everything running around here, and but I hired them when they turned 11, each one of them. I said, you got to be 11. And I was careful what I mounted them on. I didn't, if it wasn't safe, I wouldn't mount them. But I was particular that way to keep them safe and not get them scared. And when they were 12, so I give them $1 a ride. And they were homeschooled. Their mother homeschooled them. So if they whipped up on their studies, they were out there with me, sometimes by mid-morning. And when they turned 12, I paid them $2 a ride, and I tripled it when they're 13, and $4. Pretty soon they got their own customers. And so they have had a chance to work with some of the really, really good hands in the West. Well, not just in the West. My daughter went to Italy and was around some really good hands. And so they kind of turned into my go-to people. So I like, what would you do here? And I respect their opinion about as much as anybody living today. I wished Tom could have worked around them, but they were pretty small when he passed away. Well, I say maybe 11, right in that area, But he didn't spend any time with them. Not on a working type situation. but I mean, that my boys, that's all they did for. That's what they still do. I think my youngest son was 13 or 14, and my oldest son hired him, and they took off as soon as my oldest son got his driver's license. And they've been all over the West. They knew everybody in Texas, it seemed like, and got in the cow horse world, and people starting horses in Canada and Hawaii. And I was over there in Hawaii. We had kind of a family reunion when they were starting a pretty good bunch, and people put their name. Anybody that started horses there puts their name, and then the year behind it. I counted 14 behind my oldest son, and 10 or 11 behind my youngest son. And I mean, they've had a lot of experience. I mean, I spent a lot of time cowboying and handling cattle and crews and all that. I mean, they just started horses. That's what my youngest one, that's what he does now, is he just starts cutters. And here last year he had one that he started and rode for a year that won the futurity, and he's had a bunch of them in the finals. He's the one. If I got a problem, I'm going to him, or my daughter, or my other son. I mean, I respect them. So, people would say, "Well, you've done all these clinics, and you're talking to your children for advice." Well, I can remember Bill, the whole time I was with Bill, he said, "Oh, I got to show you something my younger brother Tom showed me." And people, well, he's your younger brother and he helps you? Big time. And he didn't let pride get in his way at all. And I don't either. I don't care. I don't care what people think of me. I want to learn something about this. I'll get my source any place I can. And my own 3 kids, they're my best source now. Joe Walter and I talk it over quite a bit and things, but
yeah,
life's too short for trial.
Bryan, can I ask you something about that?
Sure.
About your children? A lot of people in all walks of life, they have kids plan quite a bit about their kids' lives and how it's going to go, and try to provide the best experiences they can. And I'm wondering, did you put a lot of thought into helping your kids find horsemanship as a career? And would it have,
No,
I guess, disappointed you if any of them hadn't done it?
no, no. I mean, that's all we knew around
pure
here.
Natural.
They didn't have.
It's in the Neubert blood.
Their only friends were the sons to a friend of mine who was cow boss on one of the bigger ranches in the area. So they go to their place and ride colts, or they come here and ride colts, and they kind of learn to rope together. And so before I was even married, I was thinking stupidly that if I ever have kids, I'm going to be able to help them, and they won't have to go through a lot of the hardship that I went through. But it doesn't work that way. You're still going to do what you think is the best deal. And like I've heard Tom say, what he has been practicing and working on, it doesn't fit human nature. So they still have to fail. Failure is a very, very important part of success. And so once we got them going, and they had ponies and everything going around, I made a promise to myself. I'm not helping these kids with their colts unless one of 3 factors. If they're getting ready to hurt themselves, I got to step in and say, hold it. Don't do that. This is what could happen. If they're getting ready to hurt a horse, I got to say, hang on here. I've seen this or heard of this happening. Don't do that. And the third factor is if they ask. If they ask my help, I'm right there. And I told you about the guy in the bunkhouse and how Tom Dorrance, he never trained a horse. And it's all so subtle. And many times, I mean, they were here all during their teen years. And except for when the oldest one got his driver's license and then they took off. But they always come back. They always start a bunch of. They like to rope calves, so they come here during branding time and brand around the community, and then off again they go. But just because I say it so, I'm not going to help you. And struggling is a big factor. If they want to ask for help, I would help them. But as far as trying to mold them into something that I wanted, I mean, that's all they knew. That's all they knew, and they got interested in it, and they had to go with me to the clinics because, you know, you can't leave kids home when you're gone. They had a lot of projects, but they would fill the trailer with ponies and everything that could pack in, and so they got to see a lot of problems with the people and how I might solve it. But experimenting is real important. Failure is a very, very important part of success. I think it's real important. And on that, I don't know if you care, but I'm thinking back on Bill, and Bill, he couldn't have been nicer. Just could not have been nicer. Just so sincere of a fella, and he would kind of hold my hand through things. And looking back on it, Ray Hunt would be like, I mean, he would challenge me. I mean, he wouldn't say a word until I was starving for it, you know, which was good because he let me say. And Tom was kind of in the middle. There was a lot of projects where Tom would say, I got to show you something that I learned in 1936 or something like that. And then part of the time he would kind of let me suffer too, which is valuable. So all three of them were a little bit different. So, I mean, I've given that quite a bit of thought. I don't know which was just starting out as a 14 turning 15-year-old. I don't know what Bill could have done different than really hold my hand, keep me out of trouble. And I think back on Bill, you know, he was this great horseman, and what he must have gone through to get down on a 14-year-old kid's level. You know, we went to the first snaffle bit fraternity ever was, and he said, let's go see that. And we met there, and here the best horseman and the showman in the whole West would come up and visit with him, and he'd introduce me to him. And I'm thinking, how do you know all these people? Oh, I showed a few horses there at Salinas and kind of got to know them. And here he is. He's helping a 14-year-old kid. I mean, and just very, very passionate about my progress. Why he was that way, I couldn't tell you. He had 3 boys of his own, and they would do everything he said, and they would mount up, and he'd help them quite a bit with their roping and stuff, but they weren't really into the horsemanship like I was. So when I came along, he kind of glommed on to me and probably spent more time with me than he ever did with them. Or I shouldn't say ever did with them, but at that time anyway. So he was, I think he was looking for somebody like me all his life. And I mean, I don't know how he would say it. I couldn't, I wouldn't speak for him, but he was like my best friend. And he meant so much to me. He was really quite a guy. And then, like I said, Tom was way more reserved. Ray warned me about that. He said, you'll work with, he might not talk to you for a while, and when he does, you better listen because it's going to be something real important. And after I got to know him, which took a while, he just telling me childhood stories and all kind of stuff. But he wouldn't warm up to somebody right away, you know. And of course, Ray liked to laugh and play and joke, and he was pretty fun. And by the time I met Jim Dorrance, he was getting ready to wind her up, and he just was up at Bill's, wintering up at Bill's, and spent the day braiding rawhide, and I never saw him on a horse. But anyway, I got blessed.
Well, so far, Bryan, we haven't run out of anything to talk about, huh? We've been doing pretty good. Our arch enemy of nothing to talk about has not showed his ugly face. I think we could probably do like a marathon. It'd be our first all night podcast, but we could do it. If we had some Red Bulls or something.
Well, I probably talk too much, but that's what I do for a living now.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned there with Bill that he kind of, it was like he was taking the time to teach you and almost looking for someone like you. It kind of like going back to talking about your braiding clinic. People who have information, they seem to get really excited when they get around people that are as passionate about the information as they are. And, you're talking about how you can get long winded and talk about this stuff. Part of it's probably because, what Bill saw in you, like how excited you were to learn. It's just way more fun to teach people like that than it is trying to, bring along a guy who kind of half-ass wants to be there or something.
Right. I agree with you. And, my wife used to go to all the clinics with me, and she would, once in a while, she'd say, you direct everything you say to this one guy, and it might be a spectator. And you shouldn't do that. You got a whole group here. And I would say, that guy came to learn. That's obvious by his questions and his enthusiasm with my answers. And when Tom and I were working together, I'll never forget, he said, well, I had with me a clinic schedule of Ray Hunt when he was just starting out. And here he is in Wyoming and Washington and New Hampshire, and he's Texas, Wyoming, just all over the place. And I thought, boy, I wonder what that would be like. And Tom said, I think that, and he never had done a clinic or anything like it, but he said, I think you would find it to be a very unrewarding occupation. And I said, why would you say that? Bryan, I'm going to tell you, if you get one person at a clinic that has come to learn, you better consider yourself lucky. And at the time I was thinking, well, that's a gross exaggeration. They're all coming there. Some of them travel long ways and pay their money, but it's kind of true. It's kind of true. In a lot of cases, it's a social event, so-and-so is going to be there. I want to see them, or they want to be entertained. They're hoping somebody's going to buck off, or they think it's going to be the magic trainer tips, and when they find out, all I'm doing is trying to help them learn to get their idea across to a horse, then that lets the wind out of a lot of people's sails. Tom said, I seem to lose interest in people that seem to be in a hurry. And that's, they're like, okay, you showed me this, but what about that? What about this? Like, Tom would say, people will ask you a question, and while you're answering that question, you see their mind thinking about another question that they're not ready for the answer to. And that's so true. Give me a simple answer where I can it doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way with me. People come to a 4-day clinic and I'm talking hard as I can and I'm doing my very best. And I think back, how much did I learn in 4 days? You're trying to help them all you can. But like Tom said, the real learning comes when you get home and you begin to practice what you've been exposed to. And it's pretty fun when you do these clinics and you show up in the same area years later, and some people, you can see they obviously come a long ways. That's just cool. That's really fun. And I have done clinics all over the East. And the people in the East, they want to take a ride and come back in one piece. But more in the West, it'll be cowboys and ranch people and that are using their horses. So it means so much more to them if you can help them on things that they're going to need to get the job done. Back East, they're pretty much trail riders, and I don't. It's just more fun with people that I can relate to that have all kinds of jobs for their horses to do when they get home. It's way more fun, and they know a little more of what I'm talking about. You can tell.
Yeah.
Sure thing.
Yeah, this has been super enjoyable because I could have interrupted you this whole podcast only to agree with you, because you've made so many great points that don't just apply to horsemanship, but to life. Great lessons, and obviously you've learned those through a lot of years of experience, but I've really enjoyed this, Bryan. It's been great meeting you and talking with you.
Appreciate you saying so.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I have seen people think Tom was a great horseman, but that guy, I don't know if he used what he learned from the horses on everyday life, but I could tell you a ton of stories where it goes way past the horses. And his wife put together stories from people called More Than a Horseman. And she asked me to contribute, which I overdosed her probably, but she used about everything that I gave her. I couldn't hardly write all the dang stories, but I just put it in a tape recorder. And since it was More Than a Horseman, I thought she was more talking about the non-horsemanship stories. And but throughout the book, there's a lot of people that just tell about his character, and he's my hero. I'll tell you that. That's who I would like to be like more than anybody I've ever met in my life, by far.
Well, it's probably a reason why there's a lot of young people, Joe and I's age and even younger, that are starting their careers now. And although they never even met the Dorrance brothers, they're almost real life heroes to them as well, because they were that caliber of an example.
I used to read articles about people, trainers or young people riding colts, and they used the Tom Dorrance method. And I'm thinking, heck, Ray Hunt didn't even use the Tom Dorrance method. And I spent years trying to learn everything I could from him, and I would never say that I used the Tom Dorrance method. Only one guy I know in this world that uses the Tom Dorrance method, and that was Tom Dorrance. And so they have no idea what they're talking about. And it's, they just have no clue. I never tell them that.
Yeah. And if you listen to any of our previous podcasts, we've brought that up with a few other people, like Buster McClary we talked to, and we just talked about how it is funny that there's people that never met them that are carrying on that name.
They're using
but I think that, there's some people that probably use it for unscrupulous means to an end. But at the same time, I'm sure there's some people that, like I've told the story on here before, but I remember getting started at horsemanship, and Joe and I ride with Buck Brannaman a lot. And, just seeing Buck and not knowing anything and thinking, well, I want to be like Buck, so I'm going to do some clinics, and you just don't know a damn thing. And then it takes you a little while to come around. And then now we're here with you, and we're all kind of in on the joke, I guess, where you're like, you don't want to go around saying you're doing the Tom Dorrance method. But in the beginning, I think there's definitely some naivety to that, where people have a good heart, but it's this real life hero that lived, before they were born, and they're just going to hop on board and start spreading the good word,
Well, my wife used to say, you shouldn't use Tom Dorrance's name at a clinic. And I said, why do you say that? It's kind of name dropping. And I said, well, but some of these things are so cool, and I want to let the people know that I didn't think them up myself. I had somebody holding my hand, and then that starts the struggle to try to get it. it's a little bit like, I don't know, roping, riding bucking horses. Billy Etbauer could, I don't know how many times he won the world in the bronc riding. You come to Billy Etbauer's bronc riding school, I don't think he has to worry about you running him out of a world title next year. I mean, he's got thousands of horses, and he's making split-second decisions, and he's got natural talent, probably too, that make him what he was. You go to his school, you're probably gonna, if you have your heart in it, you're probably gonna ride broncs better than you did before. But he doesn't have to worry about you beating him out of a world title, I don't think. A lot of muscle memory goes into it. I can remember Tom saying, first you have to concentrate. That's with your brain. Like, here's what I want to do here. Then you have to coordinate. That get your hands and feet to do what you want them to do, like riding a bicycle or something or whatever, roping or anything. But then it's like breathing. And I've been breathing all day, and I never even thought about it till right now. Comes pretty natural to me. So that's the way, so many things I can remember struggling with. And did you feel that? Did you feel it? And he knows I didn't feel it because my hands and feet would have responded at the time needed to help the horse. So there's no sense lying to him. And I would just tell him, well, no, I didn't feel it. And there was times in my life when, and then let's set it up again. Did you feel that? No. The truth is no. But you will, he said. And times when I would get depressed and thinking I should have picked something else for a way to make a living, I would remember him saying that. But you will. And I think, is Tom ever wrong? Not much. If he says you will, you will. And some of those things that I thought I was never going to get, they're just like breathing. They're just plumb easy. You think anybody could do this. He used to say, if I could crawl inside your hide for 5 minutes and you could see how easy this is, but you can't do that with somebody. All you do, and he said, I've tried different things. I've tried getting their hand in mine. I've tried riding double and holding their hands in mine, but it just takes time. And it's a struggle. I'm just telling you, it's he didn't just show me something and I go home and do it right away. But so many things, if I see him doing it, I know it's possible. And if I know it's possible, and he says you will get it, all I got to do is endure, and I'm going to get it. And the more those things happen, the more you start thinking, it's going to happen. I'm going to get this. And you start having more trust in yourself that all you got to do is endure, hang in there. And it would be so easy if every horse was the same, but it doesn't work that way. They're as different as you and I and everybody you know, which makes it fun. It would be like stuffing envelopes if it wasn't that way.
Yeah.
So that's what. And so when I talk to friends, or I used to call him, he'd tell me a story. Okay, I had a horse like that one time, and here's what I did, and here was the outcome. And watch out for this and watch out for that. You're going to make it. And it's really been fun. I mean, I have pretty much made a living out of having fun. As soon as I left home and I didn't have any more sprinkler pipe to move, it's just been fun ever since.
Yeah. Amen.
We'll have to make a clip out of that little part about enduring, huh, Joe? That's an encouraging little tidbit.
Absolutely.
He said, this is the way it'll be. You'll come up a brick wall, and you want to get through that brick wall, and you try to go under it, and that doesn't work, and you try to go over it, and you're trying to find a crack in the bricks or some way And right about when you're at wit's end, you look down and there's a doorknob. And you just turn the doorknob and go right through a door you didn't know was there. And that's happened to me so many times. One time, you can edit out as much of what I say if you want to. But one time I had help. I went over and worked with him on a weekend before I worked with him. And I was going to go home. And he said, so there was a gate down there about 200 or 300 yards. He was still a horseback. And he said, and I was in my trailer and all hooked up and ready to go. And he said, I'll trot down and open the gate for you. And so when I pulled up there, I said, I just want to thank you one more time for helping me. And even though I can't do some things that you shared with me, I'm really going to try to get it. And he kind of looked down at me and he said, but Bryan, don't try too hard. And I thought, but if I want this really, really bad, what do you mean don't try too hard? And he said, because if you try too hard, it'll keep you from getting it. And I had no idea what he meant. And since then, I once in a while you run into somebody at a clinic that's like, you want to tell them, slow down. You're so serious. You're like trying to make things happen, and it doesn't work that way. It's way easier than that. And I know now exactly what he was talking about. You know, just keep putting in your time, get your leg over as many horses as you can. And I've thought sometimes the people have these bracelets, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And I thought I ought to have one that said WWTD, what would Tom do? And so a lot of times when I take a road trip, I mean, it's just almost nonstop stories. And I think maybe I have learned more on road trips than I have when I got a horse between my legs. It's a philosophy or a way of thinking that isn't natural. And I try to get myself in the habit of, if I did call him, what would he say? And see if I can predict it. Then if I could get to a phone, a lot of times in Nevada, it was a big drive to a phone, and might be a party line, the whole dang valley's on the phone, and think about what might be his answer, and see how close I come to predicting it, which that's helped me a ton. You know?
Yeah.
It's fun.
Well,
I've had nothing but
Bryan, that's pretty awesome advice, because I think that's something everyone struggles with, and I think that's a good thing to kind of wrap the podcast up on is you know, you have to have perseverance, but you know, it's like holding a butterfly in your hand. You can't try to hold it too tight or you'll never keep it alive. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's great. And like Ben said, man, I think we could probably sit down and make an 8-hour podcast with you if we wanted to. This is a bunch of great information. And like we joked in the beginning, you know, the clinicians, we never lack for content with the clinicians. But Bryan, I really appreciate it. You know, you were talking about those guys taking the time to work with you and stuff. I know Ben and I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and talk with us and kind of share some of these stories, and hopefully the people listening, maybe they can get something out of it too. But even if it was just me, Ben, and you sitting down having this conversation, it would mean a whole lot to me to get to hear some of this wisdom. So I really appreciate it. And I hope we get you back on sometime, because this was a lot of fun, man.
Well, can do. Just before you called, I had just eaten lunch and I was getting ready to fall asleep. Now I'm wondering if I'm going to fall asleep when I get to bed tonight. I get kind of jacked up. You know, it kind of excites me, so I appreciate it.
Heck yeah. Yeah, we have that effect, man. We're on the move.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time. It's been enjoyable.
You bet. Same here.
Well,
same here.
That's the episode, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week.